Good morning. My name is Max Gross. I'm the editor-in-chief of Commercial Observer. I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's exciting Tenant Talks program. Today's program is one I'm particularly excited about, a true legend of architecture, legends of New York development, the president of the Well Building Institute, and while my loyalties will always run to Dartmouth College, two professors from another pretty good Ivy League school, begins with an H and an A, it's Harvard. They'll all be joining me today for a very good conversation. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our program association partner, Cornet New York City. And I would like to extend a special thank you to this morning's host sponsor, L&L Holding Company. Founded in 2000 by David Levinson and Robert Lapidus. L&L Holding Company, LLC, is a privately owned real estate company with an operating and development portfolio encompassing nearly 10 million square feet of prime commercial space in New York City. L&L possesses the vision, insight, and experience necessary to identify, acquire, and reinvent underperforming properties in prime locations to unlock their full potential. The company's current portfolio includes such current and future icons as 425 Park Avenue, 390 Madison Avenue, Terminal Warehouse, TSX Broadway, and 205th Avenue. Buildings that I'm positive we will discuss in greater detail in this program. We're going to, our opening fireside chat with L&L Holding Company co-founders, titled Building with Purpose, Weaving Communities into Building Blueprints. We'll discuss how L&L's shape-shifting properties reflect the personalities of their surrounding neighborhoods and are aligning community traits with tenant location strategies. We'll also discuss what the very concept of neighborhood means in a post-coronavirus world. So without further ado, I would like to introduce two men who, in this crowd, I don't think need an introduction. David Levinson, Chairman and CEO of L&L Holding Company, and Robert Lapidus, President and Chief Investment Officer at L&L Holding Companies. Rob, David, welcome today.
Hey, how are you? I realize I have a virtual background on. I'm gonna change it so it's not too annoying. I'm glad it's the beach at least. You should only imagine what some of my virtual backgrounds look like.
I don't know, Rob, I like the beach background. It was pretty good.
I got some others that are actually even better.
Okay.
So Max, thank you for having us. Just a couple quick shout outs so I don't forget. So it is our 20th anniversary. So I want to wish happy anniversary to my partner, David, and all of the team at L&L. And more importantly, it's my 37th wedding anniversary tomorrow. So David's tolerated me for about 2 decades, but my wife has tolerated me for about 4. So shout out to my wife, who may or may not be listening to this. Anyway.
Well, mazel tov.
Thank you.
Mazel tov to you, David, too.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Max. Great to be here this morning.
So I wanted to just start with a question about what you guys are looking at, because we mentioned 390 Madison, we mentioned 425 Park, we mentioned Terminal Warehouses, TSX. There's a lot of disparate styles of real estate, styles of buildings that you guys look at, own, redevelop. So what is an L&L project? Could you guys define that?
David, you want to start?
Sure. Well, first it sort of starts with the opportunistic model, right? I mean, the opportunity has to present itself. We have to be able to look at that opportunity and see what their real potential is in a very unconstrained way. I mean, that's one of the things that we've learned, that physical structures can really be seriously modified. I mean, structurally, not just new elevators and a couple of new things in the lobby and things like that. We really can look at a building and look at it as a blank canvas and very, very quickly, because we've done a lot of it, very, very quickly assess the, the general cost of what something like that's going to be. And at the same time, we also have a view of what kind of tenant we're building, because not all of our buildings built for every tenant. Some of our buildings have 14,000 foot floors in a tower like Park Avenue. Terminal warehouse, of course, is, an entire block long. It's 775 feet long. So you can have almost a 200,000 foot floor there, and it breaks up into smaller sections, but none of it is really for small tenants. So we look at things in a very, very unconstrained way, opportunistically. We're really able to underwrite, very quickly the cost of doing something like that, and then sort of see if this is something we really can, put our capital, together to execute.
Right. And I would also add that, one of our founding principles is really best in class. And so we really think about what the building can be, what its potential can be. And, just from a risk reward perspective, building the best product is usually the best decision, because in good markets, you get the highest rents, and in bad markets, you'll still get the tenants. And the other thing that David alluded to, which is really important, is we're a very tenant-centric firm. I mean, David, as many of you know, was a top broker in the city for many, many years. And a lot of the DNA that came from that experience is really embodied in our whole organization. So we think about how tenants think about a building. We think about how they want to, why do tenants want to be in great buildings? There's a bunch of reasons, but amongst them are to be able to attract great talent, right? That they, people spend a lot of times in their offices, and having a great building and a great culture, attracts great talent. So all of that is part and parcel of what you can and can't do. And as David said, there's a limitation to what you can do with certain buildings based on a floor plate, based upon where the core is. We have certainly taken some of those challenges and changed them a lot. I mean, some of the buildings you alluded to earlier, really have been major league undertakings, not like blue sky development, where you're building just ground up, but taking these 100-year-old historic buildings and remassing them and changing columns or floor plates. So we've done all of that. So it's a best in class, tenant centric, combined with a culture that collaborates, with all of the knowledge within our organization to create that product.
What about the areas that these projects are in? And I mean, the other, I guess, the joining question to that is are neighborhoods going to be as important going forward, just because there's so much emphasis now on remote work, and there's will probably be emphasis on cost savings and stuff like that. Do you guys think that, what's your philosophy about neighborhoods?
Well, neighborhoods do matter, right? I mean, they're very different. Midtown Manhattan is very different than Chelsea and downtown, and then there's some similarities between the Flatiron District and Chelsea that are sort of adjacent. But one of the things that we believe in is, we had always learned years ago, real estate was always location, location, location. And we have inserted this whole concept of design. And I think that is a very, very powerful concept now that moves a building or a tenant's ability to go to any location. When we are underwriting, looking at our product that we're going to create, a building that we're going to create, we know that just because this building is in Chelsea, that does not mean we're only competing with tenants that are looking at Chelsea. Because people, the tenants will go to our buildings primarily because of the design, not 100% because it's next to a train station or exactly where the location is. Location does matter, and neighborhoods do matter. It's very, very important. But again, if the building is a commodity building in a particular neighborhood, the impact that it has on the marketplace is negligible. It has to just, when the tide comes in, the rents will go up. The tide goes out, the rents will go down. But specialty buildings that are really built around design, will attract tenants who could be looking downtown, could be looking midtown, could be looking in Brooklyn, and they could be looking in Chelsea. So design has become maybe the most important aspect of it. And that's worked out very well for us, because we're all, if you look at the history of our buildings, design has always been sort of the key element to it. And I think part of that comes from what Rob mentioned before. there's a group of us in the company that have been involved in the brokerage world for many, many years. And we spent many, many meetings with tenants, sitting in meetings and talking with tenants and understanding how tenants think and understanding how their engineers and architects think. So we approach a project very, very much with tenants in mind. And we've seen the trend going back really to our very first building, 155th Avenue, 20 years ago. I think it was the first rooftop gardens and dining facility that I recall of that scale. I mean, people had terraces and things of that sort, but when we first bought 155th, which was the first building we actually closed on 20 years ago, we put this magnificent large roof concept with an adjacent dining facility up at the top of the building. And that was a very, very key factor in getting that building leased. In those days, EMI came in and basically took the entire building. Now it's been remodeled and renovated and upgraded again. We won the Bowman Renovation of the Year award then. That was our first renovation. We won the Bowman Renovation of the Year award. And now it's being totally redone again. And now MasterCard is taking it for their New York headquarters. So we're almost complete with that. So design and designing around what tenants are going to need and want, so they can attract talent. That's really what that's about.
Right.
Much more than a particular neighborhood or street.
And the theme that David hit on, the commodity versus specialty building, is really part of how we think about things. And if we get a commodity building, we try to decommoditize it. And you hinted before about transformations that might take place, in the aftermath of this pandemic. There's short-term, midterm and long-term implications. And, what happens through every major experience, you learn things, right? How did airport travel change after 9/11, for example? So we're learning, and we've learned, and now we're seeing it right in our face, that, quality of air, outdoor space, amenities, all those things matter, and they're going to matter even more sort of in a post-COVID environment. So our view is that the definition of commodity versus specialty space, there's been a big gap in terms of valuations of your basic building that doesn't have a lot of investment in it versus one that's a great building, whether it's a new one or renovated. And some of the features that we're going to learn through the COVID experience will be embodied in new buildings. 425 Park already has that. We'll be incorporating all those types of things in Terminal. And I think you learn and you grow and you evolve, and you communicate to all your constituents, your tenants, the contractors, our partners, just to sort of learn and see what best practices are. And we know we don't know everything, and so we do a lot of listening and a lot of learning from others about their experiences, so we can take all that into consideration when we're designing and building buildings.
Well, so you mentioned tenants, and you mentioned like air quality is one of the things that people are looking for. Could you take us a little bit just into like the process of looking for tenants right now? I mean, has that? I imagine it's been difficult, but why don't you? But you tell me, what's that process been like?
Well, the tenants right now, I think there's a very obvious slowdown because there's a great deal of uncertainty in how things are going to play out in the near term. So tenants making commitments right now, there are some things that are going on, but I think that this is not necessarily the moment to have expectations of a lot of tenant activity, right? People are not even in the city, so you can't even necessarily even show them space or have real direct conversations with them other than something like this on Zoom. So this is, for me, in terms of priorities of what we focus on, although we have David and Andrew, who are amazing guys, and they're constantly talking to the community. I think the things that we're focusing now are just design and construction and moving that aspect of our project along, and being very, very aware in that process that tenants are going to be coming back. Some are starting to come back. Some will want certain kinds of features. We talk to all of our tenants, particularly our large tenants around that have a global footprint, and understand the kinds of things that they're going to need in the short term. But I don't think that there's, it's not the highest priority for us now to make a major effort today. I'm talking about June, to try to engage with tenants, because tenants really are thinking about other things, right? They're thinking about how they're going to start to reoccupy space. And there, we're happy to have conversations with them about that because we have them in our buildings.
So, David, you mentioned that you guys are focused now on like the construction and finishing up these buildings that are in the process. How has that changed since March?
Well, it hasn't really changed. So I think that, listen, you think about new things, but remember, we're in our point of view is we're in a moment, right? This is a moment, a challenging moment. And we have to think about that. But are we really going to be designing buildings now? Because today we need to put fewer people in elevators because of the COVID regulations and just doing things smart. Does that mean the next building I design, I'm going to have 10 more elevators because I can only put 20% of the capacity? Of course not. Because, you know, this will be behind us at some particular point in time. And the way we occupy buildings will be significantly the same. Yes, will there be less emphasis on cramming people together, benching people and things of that sort? Perhaps, certainly in the nearer term, once we get across this bridge to the new normal. And there are some things that you're going to want to design in, and some things you're not going to necessarily want to design in. You know, in the terminal building, for instance. So this is what you know, Rick Cook calls a ground scraper instead of a skyscraper, because it's 1.3 million feet and it runs from 11th Avenue to 12th Avenue, but it's really only, depending upon the part of the building, it's only 7 to 12 stories tall. So it's a ground scraper. And because it's so large and so long, there's the opportunity to actually enter this building in many different places. So you can actually have multiple entrances, multiple, and we have multiple entrances, we have multiple cores. So it actually works out very, very well for people that are concerned about a massive lobby with, you know, 5,000 people entering into it, you know, during the course of the day in a 1.3 million square foot building. That's, you know, 50 stories or 60 stories tall. So that building, yes, we're making some changes there because we can have this flexibility. But in terms of really designing things, listen, I don't think that you're going to do too much in a structural design. I think, yes, you will do things like we have already done in Park Avenue, which is high filtration systems. I think there's some conversations about UV lighting in different parts of the buildings and possible elevators. So that technology and science need to have an intersection and come together, and then you can adapt. But I think in terms of overall designing buildings, I don't think there's going to be major changes from the way we're designing buildings now. I think other people have to make major changes because they had to make those changes anyway, because our designs have always been cutting edge and very leading. So I think we've been ahead of the curve on a lot of that stuff. But again, I don't see us designing a building differently. The terminal is going to be the most bike-friendly building in the city. We're providing a lot of bike access. So we're already doing that. Now, everyone, you try to buy a bike today, you can't even buy a bicycle today because everyone is concerned about public transportation. So we've already been doing a lot of those things. If you haven't been, you have a lot of changes to make. For us, I think by and large, we're there, and maybe there's some things on the margin that we're going to learn from this in terms of more sanitizing and things of that sort. But I don't think we're going to have thermal scanners built into our buildings going forward to take everybody's temperature for, you know, years into the future. I don't think that's the kind of thing that's really going to happen. Are you doing that today for your workers on your construction site? Yes. But are you going to be doing that for your tenants down the road? I don't think so.
We looked at, you know, COVID is sort of the great accelerant. I've called it that before. So some of the trends that were already maybe reaching a plateau and starting to diminish, like densification. I think there was already conversations that, you know, the amount of square foot per person was getting too small, things were being too dense. And so there's a natural probably evolution there anyway. But, you know, what makes a city like New York great, the people, the talent, the diversity, the art, the culture, the medical entertainment, restaurants. So all of that's on temporary pause right now because we can't engage in that, right? We can't go to a Yankee game. We can't go to a Broadway show, right? We can't go to a concert. We can't go inside the restaurants. So, but that's temporary, right? At some point in time in the near future, and I think it's going to be the near future, if you listen to what's happening in some of the pharmaceutical industry, that will come back. And I think it'll come back with a roar because people are really desperate to see other people and to hug people again. And I was on a call with Steve Siegel the other day, and Steve Siegel said one of the greatest lines. He said, "I'm starting to miss people I don't even like anymore." Because of what's been happening here. So David is right. When you're leaders of a company and leaders in the community, I don't think you make decisions in the eye of the storm, right? I think you prepare for it. I think you think through it. I think you make sure, just like the analogy with your patient, if the patient's under cardiac arrest, you need to get that patient stabilized in an ICU, but not necessarily make a long-term determination based upon, the data and the news that's coming in this second, because it's evolving over time. And if you could look forward a year from now, right? A year from now, probably, God willing, this pandemic's all behind us. Vaccines are out there. Therapeutics are out there. People will be able to go and live in a normal situation. So you're not redesigning a building for a moment in time. It's going to last for 50 or 100 years, but you're thinking that through. And what do you need to do in the interim? So this next interim period, it's going to be a little bit of experimentation, right? Our construction projects are all ongoing. They were delayed for a period of time. But they're all up and running, and we had to have different protocols, right? You can't have people jamming together on a hoist. We had to think, how are we delivering food to people? You don't want people going in and out. How are you, as David said, you're taking people's temperatures on the way in. So you're doing that because people have to feel safe. And there's a lot of concern and caution, particularly since New York was the epicenter of all this. But it's a moment in time, and I think we're just gonna have to work through it. Working remotely is great, because it fills in the gap. It doesn't replace collaboration and being together. Dave and I were talking about this, that the reason why we're working fairly effectively as a company today is because we've been together for 20 years and we've been in the same office together. We know each other's culture. We know what we're thinking and doing. And so filling in the blanks is okay, but we miss being together because, this is a good filler, but it doesn't replace that. And I think that tenants, whether they're creative people in ad agencies, whether it's lawyers at a law firm, whether it's, analysts at a big institution, they need to learn from other people. You need to be there. You need to have that conversation. You're making a pitch for something, whatever it is. You want to be in a room throwing ideas back and forth, right? Dave and I, when we first came together, he used to say that, we were inside the halls of Insignia. You're walking down the hallway, you're bumping into someone, all of a sudden, the spontaneous idea, creating a culture where ideas can be talked about, having a Zoom call scheduled at 9, 10, and 11 isn't the same. So again, it's temporary. We're filling in the blanks, and we think the future is bright for cities like New York, because all the things that made it great pre-COVID are still here. And the challenges we had before, we'll still have them to a degree, but you don't just replace overnight everything that makes a city with a 350-year history just go into obsolescence.
I'm going to totally steal that Steve Siegel line, by the way.
Oh, it's a great one.
It's a really great line. Well, Rob, I'm going to say something that's a little, well, I don't know. It's piggybacking on what you're saying a little bit, but I would think that, if you're right, that things will go back, it's not going to necessarily be, pretty, but it'll get there. But I imagine there's a lot of distress opportunities out there. There are people who don't think that things will be going back, and there are properties that I imagine are in that are very heavily leveraged and that present an interesting opportunity for developers like you. So let me, are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah. So of course. So distress is a very interesting concept. And if you talk to all the major capital providers, they've all amassed war chests to pounce on the distress.
Mhm.
Remember the global financial crisis?
Oh, I remember.
Okay. And we talked about distress in the office building world. There were like 2 or 3 office buildings in New York City that traded at a serious discount, right? Because mortgage recording tax, owners are tough. The market comes back, whether it's a V recovery or U recovery. So there will be distress here, but you really have to understand what that means. If you're in, and we talked about COVID being the great accelerant. So retail was in distress. Retail has been in cardiac arrest for a while, right? It's changing. Omni-channel shopping, people are seeing what they can buy from Amazon and Walmart. It doesn't mean that there's not a need for stores, but it has to be a different experience. So there's some distress there, because if you bought a property on Madison Avenue and you underwrote $2,000 rents, and now the market's $800 or $500 or $1,000, what are you going to do? And if you leverage up the hilt there, there's distress. The hospitality industry, obviously, we shut down the city. They mark to market every day. There's some distress there. So each asset class is a little bit different. Each capitalization is a little bit different. And because the Fed has done a good job sort of pushing all this stimulus into the economy, it's slowed down that distress and opportunities. You saw in the public markets, I mean, look at what some of the publicly traded REITs were trading at the low and where they are today, right? So there was a big recovery there. The private market takes a longer period of time. So there will be distress. Our skill sets, like we're very good at creating value around real estate. So development, redevelopment, leasing. So if there are situations where someone bit off more than they could chew, there was too much leverage, maybe the developer doesn't have the capital to sort of finish the job, maybe they underwrote $100 rents and the market's 80, whatever it will be, there will be opportunities. There's one we're working on now in New York, but it's not like it's a flood. But it will happen, but I don't think it's going to be, oh my God, you're going to be buying, great assets at 50 cents on the dollar. I think there will be some opportunities in some of these asset classes, particularly with, let's say, owners who don't have the capital or want to invest capital in assets. And particularly if those assets are like commodity real estate that can't compete very well today. So we'll see. We talk to all our relationships in the city, and we think there will be some, and they'll be part of the business model going forward, but it's not going to be the business model.
Rob, you mentioned retail, and I do have to ask this question as a foodie. You guys have some of my favorite restaurants, Italy and the Nobu, and you guys did that deal with Daniel Hum at 425. I mean, dining has been so blasted by this, and so many of the, and is curating fine dining going to be possible in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, yes, the answer is absolutely yes. Again, this is one of these moments where people are stuck. They can't really see through, what it's going to be like when we get to the new normal or normal. New York dining and global dining. I mean, you think about how much part of our culture is, and certainly the Western world, right? If someone says, "I'm going to London," one of the first things someone's going to say, "There's so many great restaurants in London. Have you been to this one? Have you been to that one?" You hear that as much as or more than you hear about what's being exhibited at Albert Hall, right? Or what shows are being listed on Broadway. Those things happen too, but I think it's such a big part of our culture. When I went, I just came back. I was sort of quarantining down in Florida, and Florida came back a little sooner. So when we went out to a restaurant, I mean, we saw friends that we hadn't seen in 2.5 months. We were sitting outside and people were outside, but it was really great to see. So there's no question that dining is going to come back. Will it take a while to come back? Will there be fewer real restaurants? Will menus look a little bit different? Probably everything's going to have something on the margin, at the very least, impacted by this, because We're learning a lot. We're going to emerge from this with knowledge. More improved versions of everything should really happen here. Some of it will happen sooner. Some of it will take a little bit longer. But this is, you think about New York City and its culture. Go back to, Francis Tavern. I mean, people, it's like, it goes back to New York for a very, very long time. And there's hundreds of years of history here. People talk about New York being the epicenter of COVID. Well, of course, New York is the epicenter of everything. So why wouldn't it be the epicenter of that too? It wasn't necessarily because we did something really terribly wrong here. Listen, it's a dense population, so you get that, but that's New York. That's what makes New York the epicenter of the Western world and maybe the world in general. So why wouldn't we be the most there too, right? So we'll get through all of this. We will all learn something. We will be better for it. And that's going to affect our restaurants as well, and the menus and how we do things. So, but I think it's by and large on the margin. If people think that people are not going to go back to restaurants, I don't know. Listen, I'm a foodie too. I prepared a great meal here last night. I've actually cooked meals for Daniel Hume here in my home. I think people really got into cooking, but I think they really want to go to restaurants, and there's been a lot of curbside pickup. So restaurants are here to stay. They will come back. Unfortunately, all the ones may disappear for a while because of the capital, issues and margins. It's very, very challenging for restaurants because of the margins. But no question, it's too much part of our culture, and I think that's it's going to come back. And I think when we open our restaurant, it'll be probably one of the newer restaurants at that particular point in time of that level. So we're very, very optimistic about it.
Yeah, and fortunately, Max, as you noted, restaurateurs like the people behind Nobu in Italy, they're superb operators. Those are great operations. Yes, if you're shut down and you can't, generate income for a period of time, we just have to make an assessment as owners and fiduciaries to our investors. Are these restaurants coming back, right? No question about it, they come back. No question in our minds at all. They're at the cutting edge of what greatness is. Will it take them 6 months, 9 months, 12, 15, 18 months to get back to where they were? Absolutely. But they're going to come back. I think if you have, a different type of restaurant operation that maybe doesn't have the capital or the following behind it, you might have to cut your losses. And unfortunately, I think 25% of the unemployed people in this country were affiliated with the restaurant industry. So they really, really got crushed, particularly these mom and pop operations. So New York is definitely a food city. It's definitely going to come back. It will be different. And listen, I've been frequenting the restaurants out in the Hamptons by delivery because I want to, pick up because I want to support them. But I'm also cooking a lot, which I actually, like doing. But as soon as restaurants are opening, I'm sure my cooking days, I won't say will be behind me, but they'll be a lot less frequent.
It's very calming to cook. I find like it's a good thing. I've been doing a lot.
Have a good glass of tequila in your hand. It's an awesome experience. And that's how I cook out at the grill.
Well, I can't go tequila. That would be too much for me. A glass of red wine, a glass of beer, that's fine. Tequila, I'm on the floor.
I thought the Dartmouth culture was big drinkers.
We're into beer. We're definitely into beer, but I don't know. Tequila gives me a migraine, but that's my Jewish part. I can't escape that. But anyway, we do have a couple of questions, and then we're running late towards the next panel, but let's just go through two.
Sure.
Do you see a new trend towards suburban locations and with retail separate or mixed into residential?
There's a new trend towards suburban locations.
Well, listen, I think in the short run, I think no question in the short run, there's going to be some pickup in suburban real estate. There should be, because, transportation is an issue. Public transportation, trains, buses. I think that's going to take a while for people to have confidence to come back. Some people who are at risk, are going to tell their employers, I'm working from home, or I'm going to work from a suburban office. So I think some of that's going to happen. I know we've talked to many of our tenants, and some of our tenants are going to be doing stuff like that. So And that's fine. Listen, there are going to be some changes on the margin about how we're going about doing things. But, Rob touched on this before, if you didn't have a strong culture to begin with, it's very, very difficult to run your business on computers, on Zoom or Microsoft Teams. It really is. We've been very successful at it because we've been together for 20 years. But try to start a business. Try to hire a new executive. Say, you're responsible for this part of our business. You got 50 people that are going to report to you, and you're never going to meet them. I think that's very, very challenging. And I think the companies that are really going to go back to being together, having collaboration, stimulating thought and exchanging ideas will be the ones that are going to be the most competitive. The ones that want to spread themselves out and don't really care much about the culture. And by the way, there's been companies that don't care about their culture pre-COVID anyway, right? They just, trying to save money, and that's their business, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. But those people that are thinking about the 21st century, which is about, collaboration, intersection of ideas, health, wellness, good compensation, diversity. The companies that are thinking about those things are going to be the successful companies of the 21st century. And so spreading yourself out, yes, there may be some of it, some people, but I think, again, people are still going to come back together because it's been proven. We know it works, and I don't see this changing that in the long term.
Right. I mean, urbanization was a trend before COVID. It's going to continue to be that. But I agree with David. There will be some companies that short term are going to diversify and expand into the suburbs because you can drive there and you don't have to worry about the same mass transportation issues that we have in the city.
All right. Well, one last one before we switch to the next panel. Is L&L targeting any New York City hotel assets for conversion to office? Is that something we could start to see?
We've actually looked at a couple of those pre-COVID, and there's a couple more sort of coming our way today. The challenges around the hotel issues, has a lot to do with unions and all that kind of stuff outside of the real estate. But there are some of that. There are some of those opportunities. We are looking at them, and we'll see. There maybe are too many hotels in the city. Certainly, some of the second or third tier ones, may not recover from this. The ones backed by big franchises, will be fine because they can sort of take the hit. But yes, the answer is we look at everything. We look at a broad set of opportunities, and we lean in on the ones where we think our skill set can add value, and there's a high probability of success.
And we're building a spectacular hotel in Times Square. It's under construction. It's under construction now. It's really going to be quite spectacular.
And has his plans for that at all altered or changed with COVID or not? Sort of?
No, nothing has changed for the hotel itself. I mean, listen, in this moment in time, you have to be able to look through the crisis to complete this hotel, because right now no one's even in hotels. But we're confident that that's going to happen. But there are some other things that we're doing about COVID in terms of the podium and things of that sort. So as I say, there will be an impact on this. Some of it is going to be on the margins. Some of it might be a little bit more meaningful than on the margins because we're learning a lot. And as a result of this experience, what we're going to learn from this experience, we're going to create better product, better buildings, better lifestyles going forward in the future. We've done it over and over again, and we're just going to come out stronger and smarter.
Well, better buildings is actually the ideal segue to talk about for our next panel. I don't know whether you planned that, David, but if you did, excellent work.
His timing has always been excellent. Max, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Rob. And David, I believe you're going to be staying with us for our next panel. Right. But our next panel today is led by a truly influential lineup of real estate and design leaders. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joseph Allen, assistant professor at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Lord Norman Foster, the founder and executive chairman of Foster and Partners, Rachel Gutter, the president of the International Well Building Institute, David Levinson, whom you all know, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of L&L Holding Company, and John Maycomer, Senior Lecturer at Harvard Business School. Is everybody on? I think everybody's on.
Hey, guys. Good to see you all.
Good to see you all.
Hi there.
One of the things that we wanted to talk about in this panel was David's building, 425 Park, but I think that there's a lot of, and just how it has been a very, great example of like what a development that really pays attention to a healthy building looks like. I did want to just make this a slightly broader discussion about like, healthy buildings in general, and like, what, the real estate community can learn from this, and what, what it means, and, just how it played a role in COVID. I would love to start with Rachel Gutter. Could you, if you want to start, just tell us a little bit about well buildings and what that means, and like, I guess what the difference is between that and a green building, which is, I guess, a sort of elementary question, but by all means.
Always good to start with the fundamentals. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm glad you introduced the parallel of green buildings, because usually when somebody asks me what is well, the first thing I say back is, have you heard of LEED? Or if I'm in Europe, have you heard of BREEAM? Because definitely the origins of well were inspired by LEED, but whereas the focal point of a LEED or a green building certification is planetary health, the focal point of well certification is human health. So we're looking across 10 what we refer to as concepts, all of the different ways in which our built environments, but also our organizations, our programs, our policies, protocols, amenities can enhance our health, well-being, performance, and productivity. So that ranges from familiar concepts within green building, like air quality, lighting, and daylighting, but also touches upon a number of subjects that either historically haven't been dealt with within green buildings or more on the periphery, things like water quality as opposed to water efficiency, movement, nourishment, mental health and well-being, community connectivity. We offer a certification called WELL that's available for buildings of all varieties except for single-family homes. We also have a system for communities, so for addressing the places and the spaces between the buildings. And we have two products that I think are particularly important for this moment. One is our WELL Portfolio program, which honors the way that organizations make change and rewards them for their incremental progress across all of their buildings or all of their assets. And a brand new product that we just launched about a week ago called the WELL Health Safety Rating, which very specifically addresses facilities, operations, and management. So it's effectively a subset of the larger feature library of WELL that's particularly targeted to the needs that owners and operators have in the time of COVID-19.
I wanted to also get a little bit of a sense of the buildings that have not done it right. So Dr. Allen, tell us, what is sick building syndrome? Tell us a little bit about this. You wrote about this. I think you're on mute. Wait a minute. I think our administrator needs to take you off mute. Hang on one second. Are you there? Okay, well, I guess we'll come back to you, Dr. Allen. My apologies about that. Lord Foster, I did want to ask you, this is a question, healthy buildings has been something that you've been interested in for decades, since the 60s and 70s. Tell us a little bit about your thinking and, what's been the, how you got into thinking about these topics.
Well, I guess that the practice starting in the 1960s, at that time was arguably the birth of the green movement. You had Rachel Carson, who drew attention to the harmful effects of pesticides. That was really the birth of the green movement. And in a sense, I suppose our practice as architects reflected that. So the earliest projects were breathing buildings. They were working with nature, a high emphasis on natural light, on views. All of these things were quite subjective until relatively recently. And the kind of studies that Joe Allen has done at the Harvard School of Public Health, Kate's insights into the rating, which is about the health of the occupants as opposed to the building's impact on the environment. All of these have come together. So we have pioneered buildings with David at 425 Park, with Steve Jobs at Apple, with Brian Roberts at Comcast, Mike Bloomberg, and yes, excuse me.
I think that's a test from Dr. Allen. I think we can hear him now, but anyway, well, Lord Foster, please continue, and then we'll get to you in one moment, Dr. Allen. My apologies.
So I guess that the building which is the subject of this conversation, 425 Park, if you put all this together, it has incredible views. It has a variety of spaces. So the spaces at the top command the horizon, the sky. In the middle, you can see Central Park. At the base, you relate to the avenue. The floors at the bottom are deep and very high. There are breakout spaces, amenity spaces. You can go out to a terrace. Because it doesn't have the traditional central core, and if you think of most office buildings, one size fits all. They're the same size floor. The middle is occupied by the core. So if you want to pull fresh air in, you're pulling it in from the top. You're then pulling it all the way down the building. You're recirculating it. That's a centralized system. In 425 Park, the core, the solid bits with all the machinery and the services, is on the side. So you have access to fresh air at every floor. It's decentralized, so you can tune every floor for the needs of those occupants. You have a lot of variety. You have cafes, meditation spaces. So this is about lifestyle. It's about health, which is materially in terms of the air that you breathe. It's spiritual in terms of the views. That is an irreversible trend. The pandemic has accelerated it. And in a competitive job market, if you can choose where you're going to work, there's no question, you're going to pick a healthy building.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Allen, I think we have you now. And gosh, I wish I had made that.
Thank you.
Well, I wish I had made that crack about Dartmouth. Everybody's going to think I sabotaged you, and earlier. Alan, tell us a little bit about sick building syndrome.
Yeah, I get the double unfortunate there. My mic went quiet now, and then I had to follow Norman. So that's tough to follow. Norman, it's great to see you. Yeah, look, we've been in the sick building era. And that started in about the 70s as we started to tighten up our building envelopes, and we made all these decisions around energy first, not people first. And we started to choke off the air supply in our buildings, really. And that gave rise, the first time you saw this term sick building syndrome was the early 80s, right after that global energy crisis, right after we started tightening up our building envelopes without focusing on people. The problem is the standards are set for these bare minimums, set by engineers, not by public health scientists. These engineers have been arguing for themselves over 40 years. Is this an energy standard or a health-based standard? That's the problem. They can't quite agree on what they were trying to do in the first place. And then when they decided, they picked levels, an operating level of fresh air that comes in that doesn't match with the science. We know the science is really clear. Higher ventilation rates lead to a whole host of benefits, including my work and my team's work that Norman mentioned on cognitive function, better reduced infectious disease transmission, reductions in sick building symptoms. So there's all these benefits. And if you think about what happened before that era in 1970, our ventilation rates used to be set for health. In fact, they used to be set for infectious disease transmission. And we lost our way starting in the 70s. Now, it's a little bit preaching to the choir here. Norman has been talking about breathable buildings and buildings that breathe since the 60s and 70s and before that. So, you know, we feel this moment right now, and why we chose to partner up with David, Rob, and Norman, why John and I really wanted to take 425 and talk about this tower for the people, is we really feel it's a teachable moment for people in public health and also students in business school to say there's a better way forward. We can get out of this sick building era. And in fact, the economics are really perfect, right? We've been saying, well, we can't do this, it costs too much. Healthy buildings don't cost a lot of money. That's a misnomer, especially as soon as you include these health and human performance benefits, it becomes a no-brainer. So I'm hopeful, as Norman said, these trends are accelerating, that this shift to healthy buildings is on, and we'll get out of this sick building era and have healthy buildings that become the norm, not the exception.
Well, John, I to just piggyback on that. I mean, do you think has like the healthy building message sunk in within real estate? Like, do other real estate developers and owners, have they accepted this evangel?
So I need to make another comment first. I also went to Dartmouth and actually got engaged at one of my reunions, and Kristen and I have been married 37 years this June, just like Rob. So thank you for connecting those two things together. And we're not going to talk about whether there was appropriate social distancing in fraternities in Dartmouth in the mid 70s. So no, the message has not gotten out. This is really early days. And that was what my interest was as a teacher. And I spent 30 years as a practitioner in construction and real estate. And you watch how things propagate through. In my time, there weren't even really rubber roofs when I first came. There were built up roofs with asphalt and gravel. And eventually that kind of thing propagated through the rest of the industry, as did green buildings. So what interested me was in working with Joe around how do we take the clear economic benefits of the cognitive function study that he did and translate that in a way that tenant companies get it and are able to assess the quality of the base building. Similarly to how we thought 10 years ago, is the tenant able to actually assess the all-in cost of energy and the use of energy in the base building. So what's interesting to us is to see how a really premier building in a premier location with a premier team, how that learning will propagate through the industry, because we think it's quite clear that there's been sort of a mistake around some facilities person gets a pat in the back for saving 2 cents on electricity and 3 cents for stretching out cheap filters, when in the meantime, you're losing tens of thousands of dollars of health and productivity because the people aren't functioning as well as they could. So that's why we thought the 425 was a great illustration. But Joe and Rachel, actually everybody on this call, is very aligned with how can we see where this makes sense out in the broader marketplace.
Well, David, you're the one who made the decision on this. So why don't you take us through your thinking on this? Like, you know, when did you guys decide, all right, this is what this project is going to be, and this is, you know, and this is why?
Well, it goes back to the very beginning. So, and the very beginning is quite a while ago. For those of you that are not aware, we actually started this process in 2004. That's a long time. That's 16 years ago, when we realized that this potential development site would become available, when we started the process of trying to acquire. So that's a long time. But in New York City, sometimes that's what it takes, and that's why this is the first new block front building on Parkway Avenue in 50 years, and it'll be, by the time we finish and the next one gets built, it could be 60 years. Who knows? Although JP Morgan and Norman is doing that, so that'll be a few years. So it'll be 50 plus years. But we knew that this particular site, the Grand Boulevard of Commerce, the Plaza District, was very, very special, and that we had to find the intersection of our commercial interests and doing something for the city and the community and the people that worked in the building. So we actually felt like we were trustees. We knew that this building was going to be there long after we were gone. And we wanted to make sure that we did something that really mattered and made a difference. And also we had this intersection again because of our commercial interests as well. So at that point, we decided we were going to build the best building that we could build. And that's how it really started. So now what was that, right? Was it just design? A huge part of it, from an architectural standpoint. But how would our tenants work in that building? How would we want to be in that building? So all of these different things started to come into play. And as time went on, because we had, most of the time we were really concentrating on acquiring the site, getting the site, vacating the site. And then we really started thinking about the design of the site much later on. That was actually in 2012 when we met Norman and selected Norman to work with us in a partnership to build this building. And we had a tremendous exchange. Norman presented a lot of wonderful ideas to us. Some of them were ones that we knew we could do, some of the things that we knew we couldn't do. We toured, we went around not the entire world, but we looked at buildings over in Europe and in the United States to look at the best practices. There actually were better buildings, more advanced buildings being built in Europe than here in New York. That's a whole nother conversation why that happens. But we, again, it was always in the paradigm of building the best building that we could build. Now, we knew we were also going to be in the 21st century. So we started to think about all the things that that we believe were going to really matter in the 21st century, that had relevance in the 20th century, but were not fully there. Right now, everyone in the 20th century, everyone wanted to have a gym, right? You had to have a gym, you had to do physical exercise. Well, for us, we started to think about the building and we started to think about the mind and the body coming together. That was really sort of the essence of the paradigm that we looked at. So obviously health, fresh air is sort of at the maybe the most important part of this thing. Lighting systems, all of the things that have been talked about before. I've been meditating for, I'm not sure how many years it is now. It's at least 7 years with the David Lynch Foundation, Bob Roth, those of you who are familiar with him. So I knew how important that was to me and the people that were surrounding me. We wanted to also put that into the building to train and give the opportunity to train our tenants. So up on the amenity floor, which is a floor that is spectacular. I'm sure everyone here knows about it and has seen it because it's 38 feet high. Norman designed an amazing floor, 19-foot pieces of diamond-shaped glass, gardens on the outside. #1 chef in the world is going to provide the highest quality food. And David Lynch Foundation, we're building there, and it's going to have rooms for meditation and training. So this is the intersection of mind and body, and we think that's really what the 21st century is about. So that, again, is the paradigm that we worked through. And Norman and his team really helped us figure all that out and design the building that sort of, as Norman says, breathes in the back. And by the way, if you go take a look at the back of this building where it breathes, it is stunning. It is gorgeous. The back of this building is really more beautiful than most of the buildings on Park Avenue.
Before I get to some other questions for some other people, I just wanted to ask the panel broadly. This is something that John, touched on. He gave a definitive answer, but I would like to, just survey the rest of the panel on this. Do you think that there is a market for a well building in a financial crisis or in the crisis that we're in now? David, why don't you start?
Well, so listen, absolutely, there's no question about it. I mean, I think that this is how buildings need to be built. I think whether you're in a financial crisis or whether you're in more normal times, this is what you need to do. Because if you don't do it, that's really the big problem. This is the way the world is going. If you're not going to get there, you're going to just get left out. There really is, there's nothing really to think about other than, do I want to be left out or not? Do I want to have a building of the future or not? Do I want to have a competitive building, right? I mean, think about it. People are going to be much more conscious of this. Listen, we have a huge advantage because it's very hard to build buildings in New York City. So there's not all of a sudden there's going to be lots of buildings that are of this standard. It's going to be a long time before there are buildings at this standard. But if you're building buildings, you absolutely have to do this. Otherwise you're building an antique.
May I interrupt?
Of course.
I'm not really of David's profession. I just serve David. But I don't think it's a trade secret, David, that before the whole virus thing, what you are offering at 425 is commanding the highest returns in the market. In other words, it's hugely attractive. The idea that as a tenant can take a variety of spaces and buy into this whole healthy building concept. It's not my place perhaps to say so, but I mean, you've demonstrated this point as I can see.
Thank you.
I'll add to
Yeah,
Norman.
I want to talk.
Rachel.
Okay, I'll tack on to that and say that, you know, I think one thing that's demonstrative of the shift in perception around the relevance, the importance, and the urgency of healthy buildings is the shift in the conversations we're having with customers and prospective customers about the value proposition. Pre-COVID-19, as a lot of this conversation has reflected, we were talking about recruitment and retention, whether it was attracting the best talent or attracting the best tenants. In fact, we had a major developer who said to me, because of Well, we've re-envisioned what our role is as a property developer and manager. And we now think of ourselves as partners to our tenants in recruiting and retaining the best talent. I thought that was a profound shift. But now flash forward to where we are today. The conversation has fundamentally shifted. Now the conversation is, what can you do to help me take all of the precautions that I possibly can to make this building as safe and protective as it possibly can be? That's a shift from a conversation where well and healthy buildings went from sounding like a nice to have, sounding like a luxury, to sounding like a matter of life and death. And you know, Joe, I'm sure, has tremendous perspective to share. If you follow his Twitter feed, you will hear about the evolving conversation about aerosolization, something that's been way over ignored in the conversation around COVID-19. Buildings have an enormous role to play in the fight against COVID-19. They are our first line of defense as we start to make our way back to work. So the conversation has shifted massively. And as David said, you know, this has gone very quickly from being a nice to have to being a, you know, what's your excuse for not doing that? And why don't you feel that obligation to the people inside of your buildings?
Yeah, that's great, Rachel. And I agree. You know, I've been writing since early February when we saw this in late January, that buildings have to be that first line of defense and giving people strategies for what they can do to address COVID-19. In fact, I wrote an editorial in early December with a colleague about buildings and pandemics, not knowing what the future held, but certainly knowing that a pandemic would come. So we've long known that buildings can act as a barrier or help us prevent disease transmission. I'll add on to Norman's and Rachel's comment there. There's another pressure that's coming. And John and I talk about this in our book, Healthy Buildings, where we talk about people interviewing their building. So it is about retention, recruitment of people. It's coming, this bottom-up pressure. In the book, we give examples, you know, on that website Glassdoor. People report about their jobs, their salaries, their titles. They're also reporting about the building. I don't think people realize that. It smells in here. The air quality is bad. I can't concentrate. You'll find this. That is permanently attached to buildings now. What we see now with COVID, the same thing. And in a couple of presentations, I pulled comments that people are posting about their building right now. Some comments like, how is this building any different than being stuck on a cruise ship for 8 hours? Now imagine that's tagged to your building. That's hard to recover from. The next top talent will come and see that. And John's been taking it a step further, thinking about how do we start to put in sensors to verify performance here and think about what other objective data people are going to be relying on in addition to the subjective opinions of people reporting on their building.
Joe, I have to ask though, so you wrote this column in December about buildings and pandemics. I mean, you know, we're, aside from your prophecy skills, which are like, you know, incredible, I do have to ask though, so what have you learned since then? So we've had this like, you know, massive experiment, if you will, just of like, you know, what happened? Like since you wrote that column, like what were the things that we've learned about buildings in the role of this? COVID?
Yeah, I mean, not really, you know, prophecy here. You know, in public health, we've been talking about pandemics for a long time. We narrowly escaped 2 other coronavirus pandemics with MERS and SARS-1. We narrowly escaped influenza pandemics with H5N1 and H1N1. So we knew it was going to happen. It was just a matter of when. We didn't know it was going to be this year, and we didn't know it was going to be this coronavirus. And this is hitting us quite hard, as we're seeing. What I've seen a shift in is this: people early on maybe I could name everybody playing in the healthy building space in January. Now everybody's in it because they recognize they have to be in it. Your business is at stake. If your building is not being leveraged to keep people safe, it's a problem. The other thing I've learned is this: the good companies are looking forward, right? January 2020 is gone. The companies that are looking back and saying, I can't wait to get back to pre-COVID. Well, there's no going back. It's only going through this. And so the smart companies are saying, well, I'm going to address the COVID risks right now, use my building, higher ventilation rates, better filtration. And then they're thinking, well, what else? People are going to ask, well, what about acoustics? What about lighting? People's perceptions and expectations about buildings have changed. And then the really good companies are thinking even beyond that and saying, this is wrapped into bigger conversations of climate, sustainable development goals, ESG, and really the shift that we saw happening before COVID, which is redefining the role of corporations and buildings. At the center of all of this, John and I talk about these global mega changes that are happening and were happening. At the center of it, without exaggeration, are our decisions around buildings. The decisions we're making with buildings determine our health, both time indoors and health beyond the four walls in terms of resource consumption and how buildings are sited and the energy they use.
Can I add a comment about the earlier question about, it wasn't phrased like this, but it was about about how you penetrate the market. I think that there's an interesting paradox. The curve of innovation is led by a kind of progressive fringe. And so the examples that we've been talking about, including 425, are at the leading edge. And as in all innovations, you get the early takers, and then you get the groundswell, you get the acceptance. And that becomes a kind of unstoppable force. The paradox that I mentioned is that when I said that the roots go back to the 1960s, actually they go much further back. If you look at the pioneering work of Florence Nightingale and the hospitals that she helped to design that were prefabricated and sent out to the Crimea War, they were all about cross ventilation to avoid infectious diseases. So there's a very distinguished history for this, what is now seen as a recent trend.
Aside, Lord Foster, aside from ventilation, what is the most, or if that's the most important, what's the second most important, like design element?
I think it's what David said, the meeting of the mind and the body. It's those things that you can quantify and those things which are difficult to quantify, although Joe Allen and his team have gone a long way to doing that. How do you quantify somebody who can be looking at a screen, take their eyes away and look outside and see a distant view? People have quantified that, 7 to 10% increase in working efficiency. So it is access to fresh air, it's access to views, it's variety. Lifestyle is increasingly about variety, and perhaps one of the things which will be more lasting, although it's an inevitable trend, more lasting perhaps, is the way in which people divide their time between a variety of spaces. And again, it's no secret that in medical research buildings, most of the breakthroughs take place in the social areas. They don't take place in the laboratories where they're designed to innovate. It's that combination of the workplace and the social space, the social dimension, the lifestyle.
Max, I'd like to add something to that too.
Of course.
Thank you. Yes, fresh air, as I said before, and I think everyone agreed, is sort of is a keystone to a healthy building. But as we did when we thought about the amenity floor, we wanted to be able to give our tenants the opportunity from working in spaces that had fresh air, had the maximum amount of light because it's floor to ceiling, truly floor to ceiling glass. There's no columns on the whole tower. There are no columns in the corner of a building. I don't think you'll find a building in the city that doesn't have columns in the corner. But they could go to that amenity floor. They could have this intersection like this, but they could go outside too. They could go outside or do their meditation. And when I said mind and body, I also want to add something, and sorry I didn't say this before, about the spirit. Now, not everyone is a believer, but inside this building, throughout the concrete in there is, we have Feng Shui crystals designed into the building. They're designed into the building, they had to be engineered into the building. There are Feng Shui mirrors that are in this building. They keep energy flows going in certain directions. There are wind chimes that are designed into this building. So we went all the way. It's mind, body, and spirit, between meditation, Feng Shui, clean living, outside air, all of these different kinds of things. This is how we see the 21st century. It goes beyond that. We distribute antenna systems. It's a very holistic experience being in this building, which I believe then, and Joe and I have joked about it. Joe now is giving me the data that says these things really matter. They matter a great deal. That working in this building, people spend most of their lives working in these buildings. So why shouldn't they be the best possible place? Why shouldn't we reward them to be coming to work in these best possible places? Why shouldn't we give them the opportunity to physically, mentally, and spiritually excel and produce the best results, whether it's their personal relationships or whether it's their business tasks? We wanted to create this environment that the human spirit and soul and mind and body could flourish.
Well, on
Max,
yes, go ahead, by all means.
I was just going to pick up on something that both Norman and David have alluded to, the importance of a holistic approach, which we certainly believe wholeheartedly. But I want to talk about a different type of integration that I think is critical, particularly for this moment in time. You asked what's the second most important thing after air quality. And of course, I probably get asked that question second most on this panel after Joe, or maybe John also wins out on that one. What is the most important thing that we can do right now? We know that you can't design your way out of COVID. And so it's critically important that we are thinking about an integrative approach and not siloing decisions that are happening around facilities and around operations and around management from larger conversations about the way our organizations are participating in preventing the spread of the virus. If you ask me, the most important thing that any organization can do right now is to have a policy and a culture that encourages people to stay home when they're sick. So the notion that we can just delegate these things to our architects and our engineers, that is a myth. You have to be bridging that which the building can do with that which the organization can do. And I think that's one of the things that makes Well really special. About 40 to 50% of the strategies that we offer up in Well focus on that which the organization can do. As the leader of a Fortune 15 company, mindfulness leader of a Fortune 15 company recently said to me pre-COVID, everybody keeps congratulating me for having meditation rooms in all of my buildings, but nobody ever uses them. There's an intersection of culture with space that needs to happen for these buildings to perform at their best and for us as human beings inside of them to perform at our best.
Rachel, I'll ask you just as a follow-up to something that I discussed with Joe. So, all right, and I totally get what you're saying about, like, you know, all the holistic thing, but so this was quite a, like, you know, big bomb that exploded on the world, this whole COVID crisis. Like, you know, what did you, this is basically the same question that I asked Joe. What has the Well community learned from it? Like, what are some of the lessons that we took?
Well, we've learned an enormous amount. We were watching the situation in fast forward unfold months before there were known cases of COVID-19 in the US, because our largest market by square feet is in China, and we have more than 20 people who are more or less under strict quarantine for 2 months or so before really COVID-19 became an issue on the ground here. So we started an extensive research process months before, scanning all the literature that was available. The same day we announced that we were closing our office in New York City and moving to remote work conditions across the globe for all of our offices in 12 countries, we that same day decided to press pause on our motion to bring Well version 2 out of pilot. We were scheduled for a vote with our governance council the following day. We stood up a COVID-19 task force. Joe is one of our co-chairs. We have the former head of the CDC in China. We've got a former US Surgeon General, the immediate past head of Robert Wood Johnson. What we weren't expecting was that 600 other individuals from our community would raise their hands for a 45-day sprint to crowdsource as much information as we could on what we knew about the relationship between COVID-19 and buildings. So I think that we've learned a tremendous amount, but one of the most important insights that we've gleaned that Joe alluded to is that the best practices that we had already promoted through Well for Healthy Buildings stood up very well in a pandemic. The only change that we've made coming out of the COVID-19 task force to Well version 2 has to, for the provisions that we have for bathrooms being separately ventilated, having appropriate, sink and hand washing provisions and so forth, is to say, and also add these directions for how people can properly wash your hands. That just gives you a sense. Our air quality features, we already recommended ventilation above ASHRAE standards. We already recommended source separation. So, the changes that we've made have been relatively minor, even though the interventions weren't necessarily designed for COVID-19, they still very much apply in the scenario that we find ourselves in. So these practices are evergreen, they are long-standing. There's a small set of interim strategies that are important to be deploying right now, things like de-densification, things like physical distancing and PPE. Those are the things that should go away, but the new normal is about elevating our building practices to a level where they should have been before this pandemic started.
I have a question for both John and Joe. Tell us, you guys have studied what the effect of the building is on productivity, and tell us a little bit about what you found.
Sure. Want me to go first, John, or you want to jump in? Okay, sure. I mean, look, I think the research we're finding, and now we're in our, in our 6th year of this study we call the COG effect study, are linking even minor improvements to the indoor environment to better cognitive function, better decision-making performance across domains that will make a lot of sense to business people that matter for knowledge workers. Strategy, information usage and seeking, crisis response. I mean, that's pretty applicable right now. And we find in this double-blind study is that we see these effects with minor improvements that nearly every building can make. But there's a bigger body of research behind that. And John and I talk about this in the book, and we bring forward that evidence. And we talk about the 9 foundations of a healthy building, which relies on 40 years of scientific evidence. Was I surprised about the findings of our study? Not really. My community of scientists has known about these benefits and talked about these benefits of healthy buildings on worker health and performance for a long time. Norman has known this, David has known this. And what we're trying to do with the book and the research is to pull some of that research forward, put it into language that people can understand. And then in the book, we give actually tips you can do right now in your building. I've been really careful. We were careful in the book to give tips that nearly every building can do. And I'm doing the same thing with COVID right now. And all of my writing over the past couple of months, you'll see I don't mention crazy technologies, capital improvements that cost a lot of money. We're working on schools right now. We're talking about interventions that everybody can do. They're not expensive. And it's really getting down to the basics and leveraging all of that decades of really rich science. John?
Should make one comment that didn't come up in the introduction, and not to be too self-promotional, but this is the book that Joe's talking about called Healthy Buildings. So Joe's at the Harvard School of Public Health, and I'm at the Harvard Business School, and it's unusual at Harvard for different schools to do stuff together. So I heard about this COG-FX study that Joe did that had this clear indication of a correlation between indoor air quality, notably carbon dioxide, VOCs, and particulates, and cognition. And I thought, somebody's missing the boat here on the real estate front. And so a part of what we do in the book is go through some basic math and some simple pro forma things about what do you have to believe. And if you think about how the income statement of a typical knowledge worker company like a law firm or consulting firm is maybe half payroll and maybe 20 or 30% rent, maybe 5% energy. If you look just at the energy and you save 10% and 5%, that doesn't matter that much. But if you look at payroll, you have 2 big things you can influence. One is the cost, notably, of sick outs. And people have done some of this math before around some sort of, well, without any empirical evidence around it, that if you can keep people from being sick a day or 2, that's thousands of dollars of time that comes back to your bottom line in reduced cost. Or if people like to work in your company and you don't have to replace people as often, turnover slows down. The real holy grail is around the top line. So if you think of yourself being in some stuffy conference room where you're not working as effectively you might, then go back and slouch in your desk. You don't make that extra sales call. You don't think up that extra idea. You don't do that extra trade. The ability to actually think maybe the top line, the revenue line is improved, goes straight to the bottom line. Now, we don't have a direct correlation there, but if you back into some of these themes, you only need to imagine like a 0.5% or 1% increase in the top line to more than justify any conceivable cost around a healthy building. So then the question becomes, okay, if this benefits there, how do we split this up? Does it go to landlord, tenant, or individual human beings? And the sort of value creation, value capture component to that. When Joe and I wrote the book, we thought we could prove this out just kind of hand waving around the cognitive effects just of catching cold, having the sniffles, you know, that kind of thing. Now the downside health impacts of COVID and whatever the next pandemic is are colossal. And it really makes it easy to pencil in some of these benefits. And then part of the game will be how much of that accrues directly to the tenants and how much they're willing to pay a premium rent. And we quote David in our case study, the last line of the case study is in the up market, I get the premium. This is David Levinson talking. In the down market, I get the tenant. So what you see now, I think everybody on the call the listeners will agree that in a deep recession, somebody who can pay their rent or pay their mortgage is driving the bus. And those kind of people who can make their rent are going to be able to say, here's where I want to go. And I want to go to a building that's healthy. And I definitely don't want to go to a building where people are scared to come here because they're sharing with each other on social media that it smells like fish and my colleague is sneezing on me and I feel like I'm on a cruise ship. So in all those ways, we think that the financial benefit then accrues mostly to the individuals, the occupants, and then through the tenant and through the landlord.
Or cruise ships. They're never going to recover from this. David, I did want to ask you, so obviously we've been talking, largely about 425 Park, but what has this meant for the rest of your portfolio? What have you, have you been injecting those ideas into the other buildings, like terminal warehouses, or tell us about that.
Well, yes, everything. Pre-COVID, and COVID really had very little to do with how we look at this. We've taken, collective years of doing things, as I said, going back to our first building that we ever did in 20 years ago, where we had the first outdoor roof gardens and dining facility down in that Flatiron district. So we knew about those things then. So we've been, learning and gradually, over time, making our buildings better and better. 390 Madison Avenue, I've got 11 outdoor gardens in that building. I have double height, triple height spaces, floor to ceiling glass. I mean, so we've been doing all of those things in all our buildings, where we have the opportunity to create biophilia, bringing natural, light into space, plant life. I mean, there's no question that we're all of our projects are doing that. The terminal warehouse building, if you can imagine, it was built in 1898. We've discovered through our friends at Columbia University that the trees that were in that building were growing in 1512. So you're now going to go, yes, 1512. So there's wood in this building that's over 500 years old. So now people are going to be working in an organic environment that's healthy, that's biophilic. They're going to be sitting there next to, with wood columns, massive, gorgeous wood columns, and ancient brick that's been restored. And that's the kind of environment that people are going to excel in. Their spirits are going to be stronger. Their creativity is going to be stronger. All this data now is coming together, and that's the kind of places that we are creating. COVID, again, as I say, on the margin, there's some things that are going to be done in the near term, of course, and then there'll be some things that'll be long-term impacts of this thing. But our designs going in this direction started a long time ago, and are just going to continue.
Well, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to save some time for questions. We've been getting a bunch of them. So our first question, I've been hearing some discussion about HVAC moving to underfloor systems to provide a healthier environment. Are you seeing / thinking about this moving forward? If so, what do you think of this from a design perspective, as it was not very well received previously due to the underfloor venting. I don't know who wants to take this one, but I'll
I'm
leave
happy
it.
to, unless Norman wants to jump in on it.
Well, basically, we have been pioneering, along with a tradition perhaps much more common in Europe, where you use surfaces as radiant surfaces.
Norman, you're muted.
Uh-oh.
Norman, you're muted.
The administrator, if the administrator is listening, if you could unmute Lord Foster. All right. Well, oh, there you go. Okay.
I am muted.
We got some part of it. We got the part where you were saying that in Europe there was, and then I think
Can you
fell
hear me
down.
now?
Yes.
I think that the whole concept of underfloor heating, cooling, of heating and cooling zones of radiant surfaces has a long-standing tradition in Europe. We've introduced that into some of the projects that I've mentioned. Apple, for example, has small bore pipes embedded in the concrete slabs. Hot or cold water moves through that. That is, in relative terms, new to the American market. It's been fairly mainstream over the recent past in Europe. And I think its time has come. It's healthier, it's more discreet, it consumes less energy, it consumes less space. So you don't need great ceiling voids to move huge volumes of air. It's in the move to decentralization.
You know, it's funny because I feel like when we were reporting on things like Hurricane Sandy and whatnot, people were going the other way. They were saying we should put, like, you know, mechanicals and stuff like that higher ups to, you know, protect against like flooding and stuff like that. Is there a little bit of a clash there, or is it just one of these things that one is definitely healthier than the other?
No, I think
Go ahead.
you have a greater redundancy. So if you have a crisis, if you're impacted, the fact that you're not dependent on one centralized system, that you have in effect divided your risk because each level is autonomous.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So here's another question from we got a bunch. How can developers and design professionals adapt and integrate new well-building trends into existing buildings as our world and lifestyles are quickly changing? That's a very interesting question.
When we created Well version 2, which is about 2 years ago when we started work on the pilot, we set a commitment that any well-intentioned building, or for that matter, space within a building, would be able to achieve WELL certification without the need for major capital improvements. And then we put it to the test in our own office. Our headquarters in New York City is in a historic building in Flatiron, more than 100 years old, and we had virtually no input into HVAC, fixtures, finishes, etc. It comes back to what I was saying about balancing organizational interventions with building interventions. In Well version 2, unlike a lot of green building systems, we don't have a static or fixed scorecard because we know that health isn't a one-size-fits-all. We have a menu of options. You build your own scorecard based on what's going to affect your population the most and based on what's within your control. So for our own project, for instance, we leaned heavy into organizational policies and programs, amenities, and benefits. And then we did whatever we could where the building was concerned. Turns out that buildings that were built over 100 years ago generally have a lot of attention to high quality design, from air quality, natural ventilation. One of the things that we have had the most challenges with are acoustics. You inherit these things within an existing building, but you absolutely can work through them. And I fundamentally disagree with the notion that somehow healthy buildings are reserved for not just the new construction, but also the highest end of new construction. We see existing buildings certifying, we see fire stations and YMCAs and preschools and rural schools. We know that we have created a system that can be accessible for just about anyone out there, and we continue to evolve the system to make sure that any organization or any building owner or operator could meaningfully achieve well if they really wanted to put in the effort.
Okay, last question, and then I think we're out of time. I guess this one is for David. Can you tell us how 425 Park Avenue is combating climate change? How will the building meet the local law 97 criteria?
Well, again, it's all part of the same concept that building the best building we possibly could. So, there was a building that was there of the same size that was a masonry building, which has a much more theoretical insulation and less glass. So our building is entirely glass, and we're using 25% less energy. So it already meets a lot of the standards that were already in place. It was very, very carefully thought through, and it's really not really going to be much of an issue for us because of the overall design. The glass, listen, Norman and I spent a lot of time looking at the glass, selecting the glass, building the half-scale mock-ups out in Long Island City. We would meet 0-degree days looking at the glass, its UV capabilities. So all of this was planned. The efficiency was planned in well in advance.
Okay, on that note, we are out of time, but I did want to thank a really spectacular panel today. I would like to thank all of our viewers for tuning in today to today's Tenant Talks program. I would like to thank today's host sponsor, L&L Holding Company, as well as our Tenant Talks Association partner, Cornet New York City. Don't forget to register for our upcoming Tenant Talks program. Our next program is scheduled for June 23rd, and we'll discuss high growth life science industry and the critical role the sector is playing in rebuilding New York City. We hope to have you join us on the 23rd. Thank you for tuning in today, and to our panelists, thank you very much. It was a great conversation.
Look forward to seeing all of you in person.
Me too.
Someday soon.
Hope to see you soon, Norman. Be well.
Bye.